The most destabilizing weapon of the 21st century didn't detonate, it booted up. It wasn't launched from a silo flown by drones or funded through black budgets. It lived under a teenager's bed, blinking quietly like a threat nobody recognized until it was too late. In an era obsessed with firepower, nobody expected a warhead made of code. You don't overthrow power with bullets anymore. Sometimes all it takes is a scrawny kid with root access, a stolen modem, and the arrogance to believe the world's rules are optional. This story doesn't open in Silicon Valley or Washington, D.C. It begins in a tiny Swedish apartment where a dying router flickers like a distress beacon, and a 19-year-old drowning in caffeine types a line of code that will humiliate entire industries. He wasn't trying to spark a revolution. He wasn't plotting to pick a fight with Hollywood or governments. He was angry, furious that knowledge was treated like contraband, sold only to those with wealth, or access fenced off behind laws written before the internet existed. Anger in a mind fluent in code becomes blueprint, and blueprint becomes weapon. The Pirate Bay wasn't born as a business, it was a message, a manifesto disguised as a search bar. Every upload was an act of defiance. Every download was a vote against the gatekeepers. And within a few years, that manifesto exploded through culture like a pipe bomb wired to the heart of the West's information economy. May 2006, armed police storm a data center with the choreography usually reserved for drug raids. Racks torn out, drives bagged. News anchors script the victory narrative. Los Angeles executives raise glasses. Prosecutors celebrate like they just won the Super Bowl. Then 72 hours later, the corpse sits up. Pirate Bay reappears online, not apologizing, but taunting a pirate ship firing cartoon cannonballs at Hollywood's iconic sign. It wasn't resurrected, it was reborn with a smirk. The press called it arrogance. Prosecutors called it criminal. Millions of users called it heroic. But the truth cuts deeper. They failed because Pirate Bay wasn't a target. It was a belief system wearing code as skin. No headquarters to raid, no artery to cut, no center to collapse. And that's why governments panicked. Because if 3 unknown kids could invent something immune to authority, what happens the next time someone smarter, faster, or angrier decides to rewrite the rules? The first attempt to kill Pirate Bay looked less like a legal action and more like a military operation. It was May 2006, the kind of Scandinavian morning where the sun looks clean, orderly, civilized. Yet inside a Stockholm data center, chaos was about to rewrite the future. 50-plus armed police officers breached the building with the confidence of men who believe they are ending something historic. They stormed server rooms like they were clearing narcotics labs, their boots striking tile floors, their radios buzzing with clipped commands. Metal racks were ripped from walls. Hard drives were packed into evidence crates the way U.S. agents bag cartel cash. To the outside world, it looked decisive, a surgical strike on the heart of an empire. Cameras rolled. Press statements were drafted. Swedish prosecutors addressed reporters like quarterbacks after a playoff win. Hollywood executives in Los Angeles poured champagne. Cable networks ran a simple headline: Piracy Empire Shut Down. The narrative was clean, satisfying, morally correct. The good guys had finally won. Except they hadn't. 72 hours later, while news anchors were still celebrating and police were still processing seized gear, the impossible happened. Pirate Bay came back online, not quietly, not humbly. Its homepage taunted its enemies, a pirate ship firing cartoon cannonballs directly at the Hollywood sign. It wasn't a resurrection, it was mockery. The effect was violent in its irony. Crowds didn't cheer the government's show of force. They cheered the rebels returning from the dead. Swedish youth marched with pirate flags. Forums lit up with disbelief and admiration. The media whiplash was immediate. How do you shut something down that refuses to stay shut? Behind the shock lay a larger realization. Pirate Bay was never a website in the way authorities imagined. It wasn't a building to raid or a server to unplug. It was the embodiment of an idea that treated power like a challenge rather than a threat. Authorities thought they had killed a machine. What they had actually done was baptize a movement. Their greatest tactical strike became the Pirate Bay's greatest recruitment ad. Traffic doubled, then tripled. The message was unmistakable: if you knock us down, we multiply. And for governments, that was the horror. because at that moment the story stopped being about stolen movies and music. It became about control. It forced one question into daylight: if a system built under a teenager's bed could survive a state-backed raid, what else could escape jurisdiction? What began as a raid became a prophecy. Authorities celebrated victory too early. Pirate Bay didn't just survive, it made survival look inevitable. And as governments struggled to understand why their triumph evaporated in 3 days, the world learned something terrifying about decentralized power. You cannot kill what was never alive in your terms. That was the first blow. It would not be the last. If Chapter 1 is the shockwave, Chapter 2 is the blueprint. The revelation that Pirate Bay wasn't an accident, but an engineered philosophy wearing the mask of a website. The truth is almost disappointing in its simplicity. It began as a side project. 3 young men barely old enough to rent a car in the US tinkered with a file-sharing tracker for an obscure activist group in Stockholm. No venture capital, no boardroom strategy, no glossy mission deck, just stubbornness, caffeine, and a view that information belonged to people, not corporations. But here's where it changes tone, where the documentary camera leans forward. These weren't anarchists throwing rocks at windows. They were strategists. They built Pirate Bay as if expecting war. The code itself became a declaration. Minimal interface, no accounts, no logs, nothing to subpoena, nothing to trace. Their hosting company wore lawsuits as badges. Cease and desist letters weren't threats, they were fuel. When Hollywood threatened, the founders replied with profanity and posted the exchange publicly. Traffic exploded. They learned something crucial: persecution was not a weakness, it was a growth mechanism. So Pirate Bay evolved with that doctrine: every attack must make us stronger. Its architecture mirrored guerrilla warfare, mirrors across continents, backups encrypted offshore. The entire operation could squeeze onto a thumb drive, a digital seed capable of regrowing the organism anywhere with electricity. And behind this, the emotional core, a belief that ordinary users deserved access to culture without permission. Students without money, countries without media freedom, people locked out by cost, geography, or censorship. Pirate Bay wasn't offering entertainment, it was delivering rebellion disguised as convenience. By 2005, the founders barely slept. Their server load multiplied beyond imagination. One of them mortgaged their future to keep bandwidth alive. But none of this felt like sacrifice, it felt like purpose. For every takedown notice, there were thousands of new users whispering, "Thank you." Then something subtle changed. The site stopped being theirs. It became bigger than intention, bigger than ownership. You could see it in interviews, smug jokes masking exhaustion, sarcasm, hiding cultural shock. They realized Pirate Bay wasn't a tool. It was a monster idea that would outlive them. And this is the high tension point. They didn't build Pirate Bay to be unkillable. Necessity forced it. When threats escalated, they hardened the system. When raids seemed inevitable, they rehearsed resurrection. When lawyers came, they mocked them to neutralize fear. What grew from that pressure was something terrifying to anyone who believes in centralized authority: a self-healing network, a movement that thrived on attack. This is the twist of Chapter 2. Pirate Bay didn't intend to be immortal. It became immortal because the world tried to destroy it too early. In coding their defense mechanisms, they coded their legacy. The platform evolved into something the founders couldn't fully control, but couldn't abandon. And that evolution set the stage for Chapter 3, when the world finally realizes it isn't fighting criminals or hackers at all. It is fighting a doctrine with no off switch. Meetings filled with phrases like intellectual property terrorism. Yet behind all this theater, the truth was absurd and terrifying. Their target didn't look anything like what they imagined. There was no CEO to arrest, no headquarters to shut down, no financial center to choke. What they found instead was a codebase distributed like pollen and a philosophy embedded like infection. The more they studied Pirate Bay, the clearer it became: the platform behaved like an organism, not a corporation. Every time it faced pressure, it adapted. Every legal threat spawned new mirror sites, and every government statement created more users. Pirate Bay didn't just survive investigation, it fed on it. Here is where the tone grows darker. Investigators, regulators, and executives came face to face with a nightmare. They weren't equipped for a leaderless movement. There was no manual for dismantling a system designed specifically to avoid dismantling. Centralized power was built to fight centralized threats. Pirate Bay was water poured over stone. Media coverage only amplified the panic. Young people waved flags with pirate logos. Forums framed the founders as folk heroes. Governments sensed something ancient slipping legitimacy. The public wasn't siding with authority. They were siding with the outlaws. Behind closed doors, lawmakers admitted what they couldn't say to cameras. We underestimated them. By the time multinational coalitions organized cybercrime task forces, Pirate Bay had already spread across jurisdictions, proxies, and offshore hosting. You cannot capture smoke with handcuffs. This chapter reaches its emotional climax when investigators finally grasp the metaphor. They weren't chasing criminals, they were chasing a belief. And beliefs don't obey injunctions. The establishment realized it wasn't fighting theft, it was fighting a cultural rebellion against scarcity, against gatekeeping, against control. Chapter 3 ends with a chilling pivot. The realization that Pirate Bay wasn't the disease, it was the symptom. The real threat was what the uprising represented: millions of people willing to defy authority in exchange for freedom. That was the moment governments stopped hunting servers and started hunting the humans behind them. And that transition sets the tragic tone for Chapter 4. When the raids failed and the system refused to die, the establishment made a grim choice. If you can't kill the machine, then break the men who built it. Courtrooms became battlegrounds. The Pirate Bay founders walked into their trial not as engineers, but as symbolic enemies of order. Cameras swarmed the courthouse the way they swarm celebrity scandals. Reporters called it the spectral, a spectacle disguised as justice. Prosecutors spoke in moral language, painting the defendants as masterminds corrupting society. They projected billion-dollar damage charts onto courtroom screens like casualty reports. The air carried a kind of righteousness, but beneath it something more primitive pulsed retaliation. The defendants didn't respond as expected. They sat with arms crossed, tweeting sarcasm in real time, turning testimony into dark comedy. They mocked outdated legal explanations of BitTorrent-corrected prosecutors mid-sentence and treated the trial like improv theater. It infuriated the establishment and electrified the public. Supporters gathered outside waving pirate flags, chanting as though the accused were revolutionaries, not programmers. This wasn't just a trial anymore, it was a referendum on ownership, access, and power. To governments, this was defiance. To millions online, this was resistance. But the verdict was preordained. Guilty. 1 year each. Millions in damages. The judge's voice read it with stern gravity, as if the words alone would restore order. Yet, when the news reached the internet, Pirate Bay updated its logo to a gagged Mickey Mouse, a silent middle finger to Disney-backed enforcement. The crowd roared. Authorities thought punishment would break spirit. It backfired. Traffic surged again. Here's where the emotional body blow lands behind the swagger. The founders were human. One of them didn't even attend sentencing. He was already unraveling. Despite their bravado, they became hunted individuals, targets for extradition surveillance arrest lists. The movement marched on without them, but they carried the weight. Appeals delayed prison time, but the noose tightened. Damage fees were raised, a number designed not to be collectible, but to be crushing. Sweden's Supreme Court refused to intervene. The state pivoted again. If punishing them publicly didn't collapse Pirate Bay, then destroy them personally. Pressure expanded beyond piracy accusations. Investigations dug into every corner. One founder disappeared, entirely slipping into Southeast Asia, evading capture. Another tried to build a life in exile. The last surrendered after a final defiant tour of hacker conferences, signing autographs like a rock star dragged into a sentencing column. This chapter ends on the emotional cliff edge, governments celebrating justice, unaware that their target had already become myth. They punished bodies, but the system only grew more decentralized, harder to touch. The state had exchanged tactical victory for strategic failure. And now, with the builders hunted, the real story begins: the price of becoming legend. If earlier chapters tell us how a movement was born, Chapter 5 forces us into its darkest truth. Revolutions outgrow their authors and often devour them. The Pirate Bay lived on long after the founders were sentenced. The platform didn't need them anymore. Mirrors multiplied. Magnet links replaced torrents. The organism had achieved what intelligence agencies fear most: autonomy. But while the site marched untouched, the men behind it paid a price that ideology never reimburses. Take Gottfrid, the prodigy coder. One day he was a folk hero, a symbol of defiance, and the next he was a fugitive ghost drifting through Southeast Asia. Swedish media reported sightings the way tabloids report celebrity gossip. A grainy photo at a Phnom Penh internet cafe. A rumor whispered by expats. His mother told journalists she just wanted her son back. But the story had already decided who he was: not a rebel, but a threat. That shift from nuisance to enemy changed everything. Prosecutors were no longer interested in piracy. They began looking for something darker. When Gottfrid was finally seized in Cambodia, he didn't resist. He looked gaunt, tired, a man undone by the movement he helped create. But the state wasn't finished. New charges surfaced before he even set foot in a Swedish prison, hacking government databases, accessing tax records, attempting bank fraud. To authorities, he wasn't an activist anymore, he was a security breach wearing human skin. The courtroom shifts here from spectacle to autopsy. Forensic analysts dissected his laptop the way crime scenes examine bloodstains. Malware flagged. Remote access traces surfaced. His defense argued he was a puppet, his device hijacked by unknown actors. Security researchers backed him. Yes, his system was compromised. But prosecutors countered, or maybe he staged it. Maybe the genius who engineered Pirate Bay was clever enough to falsify his own fingerprints. The verdict split the difference: guilty of breaching government systems. Not enough proof for the bank charge. 1 year served. Then Denmark arrived, almost like a sequel nobody asked for. They accused him of hacking their police infrastructure, stealing identity data. Solitary confinement. Another trial. Another sentence, this time harsher, the longest hacking punishment in Danish history. When he finally walked out of prison, thin and hollowed, Sweden arrested him again for administrative leftovers, paper cuts with handcuffs. Only in late 2015 did the doors finally open for real. His mother greeted him broken but breathing, saying he just wanted one thing: a keyboard again. That is the tragedy of Chapter 5. Pirate Bay became immortal. Its architect became disposable. The internet rewarded the myth but abandoned the man. And the price of creating something unstoppable was realizing you could not stop it, not even to save yourself. Chapter 6 isn't about servers code or court records. It's about consequences that refuse to decay. Pirate Bay survived every raid, judgment, and exile thrown at it. Its founders didn't. But the idea, the doctrine, did something. Revolutions rarely manage it detached from its makers and rewrote itself into history. Type the URL today and you'll still find something. If not the original, then its reflections, proxies, fugitive mirrors, scattered like digital seeds on hostile soil. The servers changed. The operators changed. The world changed. But the spirit didn't. It slipped into decentralized models, baked itself into anonymous mask imagery, inspired WikiLeaks, legitimized Bitcoin's evangelism for trustless systems, and seeded a generation of technologists who don't ask permission before they build. Hollywood may have won press releases. Governments may have paraded convictions. But Pirate Bay's legacy isn't cultural piracy. It is proof that centralized power is mortal online. That terrifies lawmakers far more than stolen movies ever did. And somewhere in this irony lies the emotional gravity. The movement outlived its martyrs. Gottfrid walked out of prison thinner, quieter. Frederick built a life in exile. Peter served time and faded into commentary. Yet the system they tried to cage kept breathing, learning, adapting like a creature with no head to cut off. That is the unsettling truth this chapter leaves hanging. You can punish people, but you cannot imprison an idea whose architecture is self-distributing. Pirate Bay was an early signal of something larger. The weaponization of decentralization, a world where authority becomes suggestion, not command. The emotional climax lands not with triumph, but with reckoning. Pirate Bay didn't make everything free. It made everything uncontrollable. It forced governments to face their deepest modern fear, that borders, laws, and ownership don't scale in the digital age. And so the story ends with a quiet cinematic reflection. 3 young rebels wanted culture to flow freely. Instead, they cracked open a reality where control itself became the endangered species. The platform may fade someday, but the lesson it carved into history remains: you cannot kill what was never centralized. That is Pirate Bay's true legacy, not the files it shared, but the future it made inevitable. The Pirate Bay story isn't really about piracy. It's about something America is still struggling to understand the moment power slipped from institutions into networks. What began under a teenager's desk became a living experiment in decentralized resistance. Courts tried to crush it. Corporations tried to erase it. Governments hunted its makers across continents. And yet the idea, the belief survived.
The movement has grown
in a country
beyond
built on
individual
rebellion
control.
narratives, this tale hits close to home. You can outlaw behavior, but you cannot outlaw desire.
Survive.
When access becomes privilege, people will
Ideas
build systems to
outlive people.
bypass permission. The Pirate Bay was reckless, maybe even dangerous, but it revealed something uncomfortable about us. Once people taste control over information, they don't give it back. That's the warning for the 21st century. Whether you fear chaos or fear authority, the future belongs to systems that cannot be killed by seizing one building or one person. Bitcoin WikiLeaks, anonymous mesh networks. These are heirs to Pirate Bay's principle. If you remove the center, no one owns the truth anymore. So ask yourself, what do you really fear? A world where gatekeepers decide who gets access, or a world where control dissolves and everyone holds the keys? Because this story isn't over. It's the prelude. If you believe these conversations matter, if you think power, freedom, technology, and resistance are topics worth examining, then help us push this investigation further. Hit like if this story made you think. Share it if you believe people need to hear it. Subscribe so you don't miss the next case study in digital rebellion, psychological warfare, and the future nobody is prepared for. There are more ghosts in the
You
machine.
can outlaw behavior,
Let's keep hunting them together.
but you can't outlaw desire.